All right, welcome to this panel discussion on Ask the Editors. Everything you need to know, the secrets of journal editing from people who know, right? So what I'll do is I'll begin with introductions and then move into our set of questions for the panel. And then at the end, what I'll do is leave some time for questions from the audience. So if you would hold your questions until the end, and then we'll see how many of those we can get in. So let me introduce our panelists for today. So first we have Dr. Ray Chang, Associate Professor in the Department of Security and Emergency Studies, and he is the Associate Editor for Emergency Management Science and Technology. Ray, you want to wave? There we go. Okay. Next we have Tanya Corbin. Tanya is Chair and Professor in the Department of Security and Emergency Services and Associate Editor for the Journal of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. Okay, next we have John Griffith, Associate Professor in the Department of Math Science and Technology. And John has double editing duty. He's the editor for the Online Learning Journal and also Night Flight, which is our ERAU online journal for student submissions.
Courtney McQueen is actually the editor. I'm just the helper. I carry her bags.
Great. Then we have Dr. David Higgins, Chair and Associate Professor in the Department of Humanities and Communication. David also edits more than one publication. He's the on the Editorial Advisory Board for Science Fiction Studies. He's a former associate editor for the Journal of the Fantastic in the Arts and a senior editor for the Los Angeles Review of Books, which is a public literary magazine. And next we have Cihan Aydiner. He is the associate chair and assistant professor in the Department of Security and Emergency Studies, and he's the topic editor for Frontiers in Political Science and on the editorial board for Horizon Insights. I am Dr. Christina Frederick. I'll be your moderator. I'm a professor of psychology in the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences, and I also am the co-editor for a psychological journal called The Psychology of Leaders and Leadership. So welcome to everyone here today. Welcome to our panelists, and thank you all for participating. So without any further ado, let me get into the first question for our panelists. And that question is, what common issues do you see that prevent submissions from being published? And I'm going to turn it to John Griffith first to respond.
Okay, so some of the common issues that I see are when submissions come in and the topic or the research is outside the scope of the journal. So before you submit anything to a journal, you want to look at what the scope of the journal is and maybe read a couple of the articles in the journal to see if what you plan to submit to the journal fits what that journal's all about. The second one is that sometimes submissions come in and they lack analysis or they don't provide any new research or information. So had one come in maybe a week and a half ago, looked like a great lit review, honestly, but there was no new information at all. There was no analytics done. There was no survey done. There were no numbers. And so they did what I thought was a really good literature review, and that was the reply. But again, you look at what the current thought in the field is, but then you also want to bring some new information to the table. And typically that's done through some sort of data analysis or at least some new research. And the last one is they don't follow guidance sometimes, like the guidelines of the journal. And we see this a lot with the Night Flight Journal. Like one of the guidances for short stories, the Night Flight Journal, y'all probably know what it is already, but if not, it's a way for students and faculty to express themselves in a kind of a low bar, low threat environment Okay, get their confidence up about submitting things. It's an online journal. Courtney McQueen's done a great job with this for years. And we're just trying to get people's confidence up and get them to feel like they can do something like this, because most of the submissions come from students. But a lot of times they don't follow the guidance. They just, if you got a 5-page limit, they'll send you a 10-page story, and then you got to go back and say, well, hey, look, this looks great. Can you condense this or something along those lines? So it's really paying attention to what the instructions for journal submissions are. And oh, by the way, one more thought. A lot of journals out there say we want it in APA format with these following 12 exceptions. Does that sound familiar to anybody? So you kind of got to watch out for that too.
Great, thank you, John. Cihan, would you like to jump in there?
Sure, Tina, thank you. I can also summarize main points like lack of originality. It's one of the things many editors or editorial board faces a lot. Many submissions fail to offer new insights or contribute to current, existing scholarship. So it's one point. Lack of originality is a thing always faced by editorial board and editors. We can also talk about insufficient literature. Authors should thoroughly review the current literature and what we have currently on that specific topic first. And the offered thing might be in the literature. So we should be aware of checking the current literature thoroughly before submitting any manuscript, I believe. And third thing I believe very important is methodology. If our methodologies are poor, if we don't exactly explain what kind of methodology we are using to collect our data, and also our research questions, if these are not clear, it might be another issue. I can say those three things.
Yeah, great. Tanya, would you like to jump in there also?
Sure, thanks, Tina. I would echo what my colleagues John and Cihan have already said, and then I would just mention that for my journal, it is an interdisciplinary journal, and so I think that there are some unique challenges and strengths of that come with being both a reviewer and an associate editor. So I think that one of the biggest challenges for this interdisciplinarity is that not all of our research methods or our literature are common across the disciplines. So we want to be really clear when you choose an interdisciplinary journal, which can be really powerful because your research can be disseminated through a larger audience. But I think it's really important to be really clear in your explanations. Be really clear, write it for somebody who may not be as steeped in the disciplinary literature as you are. Also, I would say the exact same thing about methods. I think the challenge comes with either poorly developed or poorly communicated research methods, an incomplete development of your theoretical perspective. And so the biggest point, just to echo Cihan's point here, I think it's important to demonstrate that you're in conversation with other scholars, not that you've heard of them, but that you're really thinking of it as being in conversation with them. So, what are you bringing to the conversation that hasn't already been talked about that might give some new insights? Because we're always in conversation and we're always standing on the shoulders of the people who've come before us. So, and then maybe just the last point would be that just really making sure that and this speaks to John's point a little bit, is this question important? Because that's one of the number one things reviewers are looking at. Is it actually interesting and important? Or is it just easy to answer? Because sometimes we do things that are easy to answer and maybe not as much of a contribution. So.
Great. Quick follow-up for our panelists on that question. Is it okay to contact the editor before submitting? Who would like to answer that one? David, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that might be very different from journal to journal or from discipline to discipline. I would say that my experience would be overall, yes, it is okay to reach out to an editor and say like, hey, I've written this thing. Is this a good fit, right, for this publication? Those kinds of things. You know, an inquiry like that, in my experience, would always be well received. You might not get the longest response possible because a lot of editors aren't going to offer a review of the thing that you're sending along before they actually have it to look at, right? So I mean, I don't think that I would expect a very long response necessarily from a journal or from a magazine to that kind of initial inquiry, but I don't think there's anything wrong with sending an inquiry like that to make sure that the match, right, or the fit would be good. And some editors might even send back some suggestions for things that they would want to see. Oh yeah, and if you're sending that along, please be sure to something. You know, those types of things would be welcome, at least in my disciplinary areas.
Any?
Yeah, Tina, I could add to that. I think that I agree with you, David, even for social sciences as well. But the one thing I would say is that we would expect people to read about the scope of the journal and to have looked at some articles published in it, and then build their inquiry off of that information, right? And to demonstrate that they think it's a fit and here's why. So yes, I think so, as long as they did that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll turn to our next question now, and that is, what common aspects or themes do you see among accepted submissions? And I'm going to turn it over to David to respond first.
Great, thank you so much, Tina. You know, the first thing I would want to say about this is that I do think journals and publications are really different, especially across discipline areas. So, for example, you know, the kind of perspective that I might be able to offer from a humanities type journal, what I'm saying may not fit at all for a chemistry journal. So just for what it's worth, there can be some very large differences between disciplinary areas. Now, that having been said, one of the things that I think is probably likely to be true across different areas would be among accepted submissions, I see a much higher likelihood for a submission to be accepted if it speaks to the concerns and the conversations that are occurring within the field at that moment. You know, so for example, right now, if you are submitting to a literary studies journal or a cultural studies journal or something like that right now, there's a lot of conversation happening in what we call the environmental humanities, because there's concerns about climate change. You know, there's all sorts of things about the natural world and the environment that are relevant conversations that are happening right now. So if someone submits and they're clearly aware of the current conversations in the field and are speaking to those, this goes to what Tanya was just saying, right? Like, you know, are you engaging with the literature, not just what's been studied, but what people are talking about, what the concerns are within that field right now? That is going to, I have seen journals take a chance on writers who are trying to speak to something important, even if they're maybe not doing the best job of it yet. I've seen journals that are willing to do mentorship to help writers sort of bring their ideas up to the level that the journal wants, if it's really speaking to something relevant within that disciplinary sort of set of conversations. Whereas on the other side, you know, maybe somebody is writing the most brilliant essay about the metaphor of the leaf in Walt Whitman, but that's not really connected to anything that's kind of going on in the larger conversations in the field. It could be the most brilliant, well-researched, original work of scholarship, but if it's not necessarily speaking to the conversations in the field in some sort of relevant way, it might well be overlooked. So the biggest piece of advice I would get on this one in terms of, you know, aspects or themes for accepted submissions is really pay attention to, right, the conversations that are occurring, like in the journal and in the journals and books and publications that are occurring in that field. What are people talking about? What are the areas of concern? How do those link up with cultural areas of concern that are happening in that moment? If you're able to connect with those conversations, because honestly, maybe that leaf paper could have been relevant in an environmental humanities context, but if you're not able to connect it to that, if you're not able to do the work to connect with those conversations, you might be overlooked in a wide variety of ways. That's what I got.
Great, thank you. Would any of our other panelists like to answer that? I think this kind of fits along with, you know, make sure you know what the scope of the journal is and what's current in the field. different journals may have different perspectives on both those issues. Okay, let's go on to our next question. How will my manuscript be handled after I submitted it? So in general, what's the process for reviewing and publishing a paper? So I'm going to turn it over to Ray to respond to that.
Yeah, so once you submit your paper, then the system will automatically generate an email to the editor-in-chief or the executive editors. Then he or she would assign your paper to an associate editor. Then us, I'm an associate editor. I need to find the peer reviewers for the author. There are some tricky points because at least in my journal, I can find at most 5 peer reviewers. So if 3 of them reject, I can still get 2 feedback. But the system insists I need to collect at least 2 opinions, suggestions from 2 reviewers. So sometimes it will take a lot of time. Yeah, depends on what time you submit your manuscript. For example, if you submit your manuscript right before the Thanksgiving or before the Christmas, that would take you a long time to wait. And some journals would just return your submission, say, hey, can you submit it like in next year after the Christmas holidays? Because they don't want to, because since you submit your manuscript, the system will calculate how many days the submission wait in the mailbox. So sometimes the editor-in-chief or associate editor will tell you, hey, I just returned that. There's nothing wrong with that. Just resubmit after the holidays because we have problems on finding the reviewers. So once we collect the opinions from 2 or 3 reviewers, the associate editors need to write a letter of recommendation to the editor-in-chief, or in my journal is executive editors, right? We need to summarize what's going on that and make another decision to them, right? Then normally they will respect my decisions. They will say, okay, because Ray said that, my associate editor said that, then we just, tell the authors it's major revision, minor revision, rejection, or accept as it is. But it is very rarely to see accept as it is. So this is a general process. Then you need to modify your manuscript based on our suggestions. So this is a general process. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'd also jump in there for a minute too, because I think many of the journals there now that are out and reputable, and even ones that aren't so reputable, have, automated systems where you submit and it's partially automated. But what I have found is that especially in the last year or so, the number of articles submitted has increased. Right, and they're coming from all over the world, right? Whereas 10 years ago, it might have been many more just from the US or, the UK or Europe. Now it's all over the world. And it can be very difficult to find 2 reviewers because those people who are willing to review often get bombarded from many different places to review. And so in recent past couple months, I've had articles that I'm having trouble finding reviewers for who would be good to review and who are willing to take on another review right at the moment. So there is kind of, I guess, a bottleneck, I would say, sometimes for some journals in some fields, due to just the increase in the number of articles we're getting and the lack of a large contingent of people to review in certain areas. And so I don't know if any of you are finding that also.
Yeah, and also I want to add one thing, right? Once the associate editors select the reviewers, right? It depends, right? Sometimes for me, I know some people, especially the young assistant professors, are waiting for the publication, or someone submit a paper will say, hey, this is my 5th year. I'm going to, submit my tenure package. So it's kind of rush. So in this case, I will send out a reminder email to my reviewers every month. So if no specific reasons, I normally send out, the system will normally send out like every 1 to 2 months. But if you need to make sure the reviewers can review your manuscript, sometimes you can tell the editor, say, hey, I really hope this can be accelerated. Then we will push a little bit on the reviewers and make sure, because some reviewers just receive the request, then put there in their mailbox for another 2 months. So we need to keep sending email, make sure he is well into or not well into review the paper. So we can quickly find another one to cover that.
Right.
That's kind of
In some
interesting.
ways, I was gonna say, in some ways, you know, in the case where things are slowed down, especially for researchers, sometimes a desk rejection from an editor could be a good thing, right?
Yeah.
That means you're not wasting your time getting something into a long and convoluted submission process and not hearing about it for months and months and months. You know, sometimes just getting that note doesn't seem to be what we're publishing, or it's out of scope, or we're just not interested, doesn't mean your article is bad, and it might actually work in your favor, because then you can seek out a better place to publish.
Yeah, and also at least for some journals I submitted, at least 2 of them, the editor-in-chief would exactly tell you where should this paper go to, right? Like he or she would tell you, okay, you need to submit to Journal of XYZ, and I really think that this paper fits there better. So they can save you time, and they also kind of like help you to navigate the right journal.
Exactly. That's a very kind editor, and very much appreciated when that occurs. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So once you get your article reviewed and get it back, how should you address reviewer comments you agree with? So first up for that one is Cihan.
Thank you, Tina. First, having a review like that is great. So if editors and reviewers are agreeing, you agree with their comments, it's wonderful. And it means you spent a lot of time on your journal, on your paper, and you missed something, and someone in the field found them. It's a great opportunity to develop your paper, develop your manuscript. We need to focus on the points to address them and be specific. If a reviewer suggests some specific point, we should exactly detail where and how we are making these changes in our responses. Also, we should incorporate all these great, reviews into our paper. It's the most important part, I believe.
Great. David, would you like to respond also?
Yeah, I agree with everything that that Cihan has just said. You know, I think that the challenge that I encounter sometimes is, this comment comes in and I agree with it, and now I feel like I need to rewrite the whole paper in order to like do what this person is saying, right? Keep proportion in mind, right? A lot of times, there'll be a reviewer comment that comes in and it'll spark perhaps a whole additional rabbit hole of direction that you can go, right? Be careful, right? A lot of times the reviewer will offer, a lot of times the peer reviewer will offer comments or suggestions or an idea, and you want to both incorporate that and use that advice in your revision process, but make sure that you are responding proportionally, right? Like you don't want to get like off into like, now I'm going to rewrite this whole paper because this brilliant insight has totally transformed my thesis, right? You know, update your thesis as needed, right? Like, and follow the suggestions as appropriate. But if they're overall giving you positive feedback, you don't want to lose track of what you were trying to say and what the core of your argument is in that process of revising with the editorial feedback. So keep proportion in mind, right?
Great. So David, would you also like to comment about what happens when you get reviewer comments you disagree with? Yeah,
sure. You know, so I think the first thing I would say is that if the reviewer has said something and you find yourself disagreeing, right? You're like, no, not at all. Stop, and try again to take really seriously what that reviewer was saying to you, right? Because sometimes the initial disagreement might be like, oh, they don't understand what I'm trying to say at all, right? Well, I would say, first of all, play the believing game, right? Rather than the doubting game. Play the like, maybe they're right, and really go as far as you are emotionally and intellectually capable of taking that negative or that thing that you disagree with seriously, because it's possible that in that thing that you initially disagree with, there is something to learn, right? There's something really important to learn and take seriously. Sometimes the thing that you disagree with the most maybe is the place where your lens could be most productively sort of like refocused. Now, that having been said, right, I think that we all get feedback sometimes, and it just, you tried hard to take it seriously, and you're just like, nope, this person's way out in left field. They have no idea what I was trying to say. What I do at that point is I respond to the editors, right? And I say, all right, like I draft a little thing where I say, I see what reviewer number 2 has said, and I think I see where they're coming from, but I respectfully disagree, or I think that that goes in a direction that this paper is not where I'm trying to go with this paper. And in order to revise in that direction, I would have to overhaul things in such a way that it, like that it compromises the integrity of the argument that I'm trying to make. So I think that like, yeah, exactly. Reviewer number 2. I really think like, and this is hard. It's like developing the strength to sort of courageously say like, I disagree with reviewer number 2. First, do everything in your power to like, see if there's something there that you need to like to work on or do. But then if it's really wrong, don't hesitate to write back to your associate editor, right? The person that you're working with, and say like, yeah, I see where this person's coming from. I think I see where this person is coming from, but I just don't think that that's right for the paper for these reasons. Show them that you've thought about it. That's what you really want to do in the editorial, like in the response that you send to the editor. Show them that you're not just dismissing it, but you thought about it and that you have a reason for not revising based on that comment. Every time I've ever seen someone take something seriously that they disagreed with, but refuse on the grounds of, right? Refuse on the grounds of like, I think I need to go in a different direction. The editors, surprised, like most of the time, they're like, okay, you thought about it. All right, we're gonna let that one pass, right? Maybe we see that your disagreement with reviewer number 2 is legit. Or worst case scenario, the journal editor writes back to you and says, well, no, actually, we think that's important, right? Like we think that you do need to take it seriously. And then, you can give it another pass at that point. That's how I approach it.
Hey, John, would you like to jump in on this question?
Absolutely. I think the key is whether you agree with the reviewer comments or not, always be polite with your response. Say, thank you for the suggestion. Oh, I didn't think about this. And I would think that, I would only argue with the reviewers when you need to, but when you do, you still want to be respectful, like Cihan and David were saying. If you can live with the suggestion and the line or reference use the line or reference that they suggest, thank you for the suggestion. Just like it's been said earlier, let them know where you put their change in, because they feel like they're part of the process and they really, they're reading your paper, they're spending their time doing it, they have a suggestion, they got a good suggestion, they give them a little credit for where you made the change. That'll make them feel like they've been heard, which is important. But if you can't live with the suggestion, it's wrong, you thank them anyway, and then you explain why you took the direction that you did. In some cases, you can make an argument and cite the idea where your idea came from, which is why you put what you did in the paper. I had a reviewer absolutely positively tell me to use the wrong statistic in my paper. I knew the reviewer was dead wrong. But instead of getting angry and say, wow, you don't know what you're doing, you're a horrible reviewer, I thank them for the suggestion, and then I explain to them the different types of data that there are and why the type of data in the study necessitated the use of this appropriate statistic that was used in the paper. And that response, they knew I thought about it and they knew I had some backup to it. So that was it. That was good enough. They didn't press it, but always be real polite. These people are volunteering their time to review these papers. No one knows everything. People will make mistakes. People are tired. People are busy. All of these factors go in to the reviewers' lives too when they're reviewing your paper. So number one, always be polite.
Okay, so let me just kind of follow up a little bit. So I think this is great advice when you have a revise and resubmit, but what about those reviewer comments that you really think are wrong or disagree with, and you know you're not going to get, or you know that your article has not been accepted? How much revision do you do if you know you're just going to submit it elsewhere?
Okay, so it's like dating. Okay, you date one person, they're not for you. You date another person, they are for you, right? Hopefully, great, that's wonderful. There's a lot of journals out there. So if you submit something to a journal and they reject it, you get an editor desk rejection, it comes back quick. It's an out of scope thing. You made a bonehead decision to submit it to that journal. You were out of scope. You didn't know, things shifted on you. You didn't. That's okay. It's okay. So that may not need a lot of changes before you submit it to another journal. But let's say, and this has happened to a friend I know. How's that? Is that what people tell psychologists? I had a friend who working with a colleague was rejected like 5 or 6 times on this article. And, you know, we were convinced, there I blew the cover. We were convinced the article was great, okay? We were convinced it was great. We were super busy at the time. We had other projects going, so we just kept shooting it to other, you know, we did a quick look and then we just shot it to other journals. Well, finally, after about the 5th or 6th rejection, you know, I printed the doggone thing out, went old school, printed it out, pulled up all of the advice that was given by the last set of reviewers and thought maybe they got something here. Because we really thought it was good, but there were holes in it. There were things we could have done better. So I made corrections based on what that reviewer said, and then submitted it to another journal, and lo and behold, it got picked up and it wasn't a problem. Okay. So I guess the short part of that is if you submit an article a couple of times and it's getting rejected, pull it back, look at the reviewers, what their comments were, think about it a little bit, you know, because when you're submitting the article, 80% of the work is done, even if it gets rejected. So you can still take their comments and you can still make it better. It won't take as much, you know, you got to get over your ego. You got to get over the thing. I don't want to spend time doing this. It's already done, doggone it. Why do I got to do it again? Just be persistent, because that article does no good in your computer. You get the rejection, you give it a day, you get over it, and then a day or 2 later, you turn back around and you send it, you know, you send it to another journal, you know, but don't let these things throw you.
John, I appreciate that. And Tina, maybe I can, since we're kind of talking about question 8, maybe I can add a little bit to this.
Please do. The question is, what should I do if I get rejected? So
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit more about rejection. I guess that would be the swiping left instead of getting your swipe right, right?
Yeah, the rejection is hard, I know, in the beginning especially. But I agree with you, John, and I would say very similar things. You know, the first thing I would say is if you do get a desk rejection, it's probably just not a fit for the journal. I agree, and they probably did you a favor by not wasting everybody's time. So, you know, look for other journals that are a better fit and go back to, you know, read the articles in those journals, read the homepage, look at the scope, reach out to the editors, all those kind of tactics if you get rejected. But if you get rejected from the reviewers, the first thing, put it away for a couple of days, because you can then come back and look at it with thoughts and not feelings, which is really a different lens. And then you reread the feedback after a few days, and then it'll guide you. how much, you know, are they really, different reviewers focus on different things. Are they focused on the real importance of your research question? Well, that's a pretty big issue. So then you've got to go back and look. If they're focused on, you know, I didn't like that you ran this statistical analysis and not this one. Well, maybe you can look into making a case or finding a different reviewer or addressing why you chose that method, which I know John is very good at doing. And so the feedback will really guide you to determine whether it has potential. Sometimes, and this is hard when you're first starting out, especially, if you aimed, you know, sometimes it's sunk costs, like economists call them. Sometimes that study just isn't going to go anywhere. I have a paper that I've had for 20 years and I have never published it because for a variety of reasons, I lost the research partner and then, but you know, that's sunk costs. I may never publish that paper and that's okay. It may find the right journal home one day, but it may not. That's okay. It was an interesting endeavor. And the last point I would just make about this is think about when you are going for tenure, going for promotion, different universities have different kind of requirements for what type of journal, what scope, and what level. And so, you know, sometimes you want to aim really high. Well, there are political science journals that have a 5% acceptance rate. I'm really never going to publish in those because I don't really do the kind of work they're looking for. So I'm never going to send something in, even though it's the top journals in the field, you know, in my discipline. On the other hand, maybe you want to, maybe you have something that fits with that journal, send it in. But I got this very good advice when I was first starting out that I will share. This was back in the days where when you got your journal rejection in the mail, then you had to go and mail it again to somewhere else, right? But one of the professors, she said, you know, I have envelopes, 5 different envelopes with addresses to different journals. And I start with the first one. And if it's fully rejected and there's no really point, then I move to the next one. And you can work your way through a couple of journals, you know, and eventually you'll find the right fit. Ideally, you wouldn't go through all that, right? Because you would have found the better home to start with and reached out. But, you know, have your next potential journal identified so that you don't get stuck and that you keep making progress. So.
Great advice. Okay, let's move to the next question. Should I follow up on a submission that's been accepted, but I haven't heard anything for months? So, Cihan.
Absolutely, yes. And it's entirely okay to follow up. But as John told, we should be polite all the time, write an email to editor, and learn about the status of our paper. And especially for books, publishing time takes a lot. So we should be persistent, but still patient.
What if you just haven't heard anything back? Not that it's been accepted, but you just haven't heard anything. It was submitted and you know that they received it and you haven't heard anything.
I think it's okay to send an email saying, you know, asking about it. Okay, and again, be real polite. I've had editors lose the article.
Yeah, me too.
And you know, it's okay because again, you're not paying these people to do this. These people are volunteering their time. Okay, so if they lose an article, don't get mad at them. Don't, you know, oh, you don't want to make an enemy. And even when you get rejected by a journal, send a thank you note to the editor. Thanks for letting me know. Sorry it didn't match what your, you know, what your needs were in the journal. Because a year from now, you may be submitting to that same journal, you know. So, but it is good to follow up, and there's a short list probably in everybody's mind of journals that they've dealt with where you're not real sure the editor's got the best organizational skills. I know we're not supposed to talk about this, but so it's okay to go back in and say, you know, did you need any more information on my submission? And even if I've done this before, even if you submit it through a system, okay, your initial, I would attach the blind copy to my email and a follow-up to the editor And I'll tell you, it worked more than it should. So we've run into this a couple times.
Excellent advice. Even the automated systems aren't necessarily completely correct at
It's
processing.
true too.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. David, did you want to jump in there? Or?
Only to say that I agree. Yeah, I think if you haven't heard anything at all, I mean, give it a little while. But if you haven't heard anything at all, definitely send a follow-up. If an editor has gotten back to you and said, "Oh, you'll hear back from us in 3 to 6 weeks," then when you get to that far point of like it's been 6 weeks, it's been 7 weeks, definitely send a follow-up. Right? There's no harm in that at all. As long as you're friendly and polite, always be polite and friendly. But there's no harm in it. And as John was saying, editors are people who have other jobs and heavy service loads and are doing a ton of things. And your friendly nudge can actually really help someone be like, "Oh yeah, I didn't realize the 6 weeks. Okay," it may very well actually help move the process along. So yeah.
Great. Okay, next up is what are the general concerns for editors when we're selecting peer reviewers? Ray, would you like to opine?
I think Tanya goes first because Tanya wants to talk about the how to be a good reviewer, right? Or Tanya, you want me to go first?
It doesn't matter to me at all. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so for me, it's the field, right? So again, at this in my journal, when we select the reviewers, we can see first his affiliation, right, in university or in the institute and the terminal degree. And also in my journal, I can see the most recent publications of this reviewer. So for me, I will carefully select those people who is qualified to review the paper. That is a very first one. Second one is based on my experience. Depends on when did you submit your paper. For example, if you submit during the summer vacation, or the winter break or spring break, I will select the reviewers working in the industry or institutes. But again, those reviewers working outside of academia might not have interest to review your paper. So depends. But the first and my very top criteria is to make sure, read the recent publications, make sure the reviewer is qualified to review. Thank you.
Great, Tanya.
Yeah, Ray, I agree 100%. That's a good point about summer too, how things get lost in that time frame and holidays, right? I think the greatest challenge for editors right now, we've already touched on this, is finding reviewers and finding reviewers who are first of all willing to review. And in my case, that are qualified to do the interdisciplinary journal review, because there's so many different disciplines. And so we need so many different reviewers to understand all the methods, understand the theory across the disciplines. So really, again, the clearer you are in those journals with your own methods and your own process and literature, the easier it'll be for us to find the reviewers. I would just make a plea about being willing to review as much as you can. I mean, I have a couple of colleagues who have a like 1 review per month limit, and that seems to be really reasonable for them. But if, being a reviewer is really good for us as scholars because it keeps us up to date, right? It helps you become a better writer when you're reviewing, helps you see what the new literature is. It helps you gain exposure to new research methods or new ways to apply them or new parts of the conversation. So I would just say that being a thoughtful reviewer and also kind of as we're reviewing, we can make it easier. We don't have to spend many hours picking apart everything that in the manuscript, right? We can really take some high level comments like, hey, give this an editorial editing for writing and grammar. You don't have to correct every grammatical error, right? You can really get some high level comments, and that might make you more willing and able to do more reviewing. And I guess we need you is
Yes. I've got a couple things here too. And then David, I'll get you too. One thing is that at least the journal I edit for will allow submitters to recommend reviewers. And I would always encourage people to really think about a reviewer, especially a reviewer that would be good in your discipline, but you know, you don't want to recommend your dissertation advisor, right? We'll figure that out pretty quick. Or, you know, the person you publish with every other month. You know, but really, I mean, I'll definitely look at those people that are recommended and reach out. Especially if I, you know, like the paper topic and think it's a good fit, but I don't necessarily have a reviewer, you know, in the list, you know, that I have on my editorial board, especially, that would be a great reviewer. I'll use one person from my editorial board and then one that is recommended from someone submitting. And the other thing I'd like to say is, you know, in the automated system that my journal uses, I probably have 1,000 names of reviewers, most of whom have not reviewed a paper since they submitted their last paper to the journal, which may be 10 years ago. I'm not going to choose any of those people. I'm also not going to choose, and it'll tell me when you last reviewed, whether you declined, whether you know, just didn't do the review. So I get a lot of data on, you know, the people that are out there who have the potential to review for my journal. So I'm looking for people who have, you know, reviewed in the last year or two, who got their reviews in on time. You know, people that I, as an editor, can almost, you know, have a better possibility that, given this is in your discipline or in your area of interest, that you'll accept the review. So that a little inside, I guess, scoop on, you know, kind of the automated system and how that works. David, did you want to jump in there also?
Yeah, just briefly, since we were talking about, you know, like when you are inevitably asked to do reviews, because you probably will be at some point in your career, right? Probably you know, there comes a point where suddenly you start getting a lot of invitations to do this work because it's so necessary and so important. You know, it's also really hard reviewing, like being a peer reviewer, because there's a Goldilocks spot that you've got to hit in between. I'm going to be really like, a lot of times you're like, well, I want to be generous and like have the teaching moment and help the revise and resubmit. Or I want to be like, no, this should not be published. This is, you know, there's something really wrong here. And you have to hit the Goldilocks spot there. And I guess what I would say is, like, the Goldilocks spot in my mind is, be generous in the way that you express to the journal editor and to the contributor the thing that really does need to be revised in order for it to be publishable, right? Like, be generous about, so, you know, like, be generous in your tone and in the way that you approach, like, this is the core problem that I see as preventing this from being publishable in its current state. But also be firm about that, because the journal needs you to be firm and the contributor needs you to be real firm and clear about what would have to occur if you see a problem, right? I mean, if it's not just cosmetic, right? If you see a problem, it's like, this really shouldn't be publishable in the field, like, unless it has these types of revisions. You've got to hit that really sweet spot between generosity and like, you know, unyieldingness. And I think it takes doing a few of reviews in order to hit that spot. So I guess that's what I would say is, like, aim for both. Like, imagine how it's going to feel like to receive that feedback. Imagine that it's like a promising graduate student that you want to encourage on some level, but that you also need to, like, draw the line in the sand and say, like, yeah, but until you understand the difference between X and Y, or until you can express this in clearer terms, right? Like, it's not going to be able to move forward, right? You do no one any favors if you are too gentle, and you do no one any favors if you're too harsh.
Yeah, agreed. And I recently had a review that I did, and I had to put it aside for a couple days because I was so furious, because it had some ethical and moral issues involved, and you know, I'd agreed to review, and I did. I had to set it aside for a couple days until, you know, I could look at it with some level of objectivity and provide a real substantive review and expressing with my concerns expressed. So, you know, that happens. Okay, so it looks like we have just about 10 minutes left. So let me open it up for some questions. So go ahead and just raise your hand and I'll call on people. Who has a question for our panelists? Anybody yet?
While you're pondering, there's a phrase called keyboard courage. I don't know if anybody's heard of that, where people are a little nasty because they're anonymous. And, you know, they know you can't reach back, you know, and say, why did you say this? And recognize that for what it is when you run across it. You know, keyboard courage is when somebody says nasty things over to you when they know you don't know who they are and that they'd never say to your face and are unnecessarily harsh. Sometimes you get that, and don't let that throw you. Just recognize that for what it is. And don't be one of those people.
Exactly. Rise above it. Rise
Yep.
above it. All right, take the high road. Any questions?
I'm seeing Allie's comment in the chat
Yes.
about how it can be important to stand your ground in a polite way. I totally agree, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Really hard the first couple of times you do it, right? So it's so anxious, but I completely agree. Like developing that skill to be able to stand your ground to, right, comments that you write, a reviewer that is challenging or is incorrect or is trying to take things in a direction that's not right for you. Finding that ability to stand your ground in a polite way is vital. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to add more things since Adi already said that. So we wrote a paper and submit to a Nature Hazards journal, one of the top journals in my field. So there is one reviewer kind of like keep accusing us miss something, some sections, misinterpret some literatures. So here is what I did is I actually point out in page 18, I talk about this section. In page 19, I utilize this research and I also add something. Then after the two review rounds, I actually reply to the editor-in-chief, say, hey, there seems something wrong with this reviewer. Is that possible to assign a new reviewer to read this paper again? Because another reviewer say, yes, we can go, right? So the editor-in-chief, who is also a very famous scholar in my field, jump in and review our manuscript. And within a week, say, yes, publish this paper. So that's my experience. So sometimes I agree with everything my previous panelists said. Sometimes you need to stand up and, utilize polite way and evidence to prove you are actually right. Thank you. My 2 cents. Thank you.
Good advice. Anything else our panelists would like to add that we haven't covered? We covered a lot of information, but are there any tips or tricks or, I hate to say tricks, tips?
Yeah, I think for question number 10, we kind of like a miss. So if we have time, do you want me to
Sure,
answer?
and that's the question is what are reviewers looking for and is this discipline specific?
Yeah, sure. So generally, I found, again, it depends on the different discipline. I think reviewers will first look at your methodology sections, make sure you are utilizing the right procedures to collect the right data. So look at the details on your methodology parts, how you collect data, how you design your research, and how you analyze those data. So the second thing is reviewers will look carefully on your suggestions and conclusions. Do these conclusions and suggestions derived from your data? So for example, your data only tell you this. You cannot, tell me, okay, so generally speaking, I suggest someone should do something. No, because your data didn't support that. That is a second thing. Then the third thing is reviewer will carefully look at, do you really understand what this journal is doing about? So I received some comments that, oh, I review your reference list. You didn't cite any paper from this journal. So I don't think you really understand this journal is doing this research. Right, so be very careful, like the previous panelists say, right? If you want to resubmit to a new journal, you need to do some research, maybe add some reference items to your reference list to make sure the reviewers or the editors think, hey, you keep reading their journal, understand the direction of the journal. So these are the three general principles I can share. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would also jump in and say that one thing that I'm looking for is organization and coherence in a paper. That, you know, in my field, I read a lot of, you know, experimental or quasi-experimental studies. So, you know, when you've stated the purpose and the hypotheses, and then you have talked about, you know, what sample you collected and your method, does that match? And, you know, and then when you get to the analyses, are you actually testing the hypotheses or you know, are you doing tests that align with the hypotheses and the purpose? There are many, many times when the stated hypotheses are not actually tested. And I'm shocked. And I you know, yeah, I kind of think of it as you're telling a story and you want, you know, you wouldn't read a book, you know, and go from, you know, chapter 1 to chapter 8, you know, 18, and then maybe read chapter 3 in a different book. But that's kind of what some of these articles feel like sometimes. You know, there's a lack of organization, a lack of coherence across the different sections. And so that's something that I think is really important to pay attention to. Okay, anyone else?
I've got one last little thing I could throw in, and this is so much less about content and more about writing. Sometimes you may get to the point, you know, after the, you know, you've been accepted, it's moved along, and then suddenly you get a draft back either from your lead editor or from a copy editor that's working with them that's just covered in red on the sentences. Don't be afraid of that. Most academic writers are actually like much poorer sentence level writers than we think that we are. And it can be very intimidating to get back a draft that is covered in red ink, right, and sentence revisions. I would say approach those courageously and thank the editors for the sentence level work that they're doing, because that sentence level revision work in order to make the sentences clear takes hours and hours a lot of times from the editor who's doing it. And it seems very mundane because it's not about your, like, you know, your idea, but it really requires like hours of intellectual labor doing that sentence level editing. So if you've got a good copy editor, or if you've got a good sentence level line editor who's helping you with that kind of work, right, send them a thank you. Usually, I mean, you know, look and see, make sure that they haven't damaged the meaning, because every once in a while that happens, right? Like make sure that they're getting the idea that you're trying to get across. But overall, it's the unsung heroes of the whole industry are copy editors and line editors. So, you know, send them a coffee or at least a thank you note.
Great. And don't be afraid of the Oxford comma. I think I'm throwing that in for Deborah and JR, who are fans of the Oxford comma. Right? All right. I think JR does the thumbs up. All right. I think at this point, we'll wrap up the panel discussion. I hope everyone has enjoyed this. I know I actually, listening to my colleagues and co-editors, you know, I learned a few things, and really, you know, a couple of the responses really gave me pause and think, do I do that? I should do that. So that's good. We can always gain more information and new knowledge from sessions like this. So I hope everyone enjoyed it. I hope everyone learned, and we will be, you know, editing this and putting out video for our faculty, and also we'll probably do a couple pieces for social media based on this. So thank you all very, very much for attending. Really appreciate it.